Retro.
Hi, this is Fred Tatasciore, and you're listening to Dennis and Jay on Podcast Stardust. The Force is strong with both of them.
Welcome to Podcast Stardust. This is the fully armed and operational podcast dedicated to Star Wars news, reviews, and discussion. I'm Dennis Keithley.
And I'm Jay Krebs.
And this episode is going to feature our discussion of the first episode of Season 2 of Light and Magic. But before we start with that, Jay, I want to remind everybody what our social media contacts are.
Absolutely, Dennis. We are very easily found on Facebook and Instagram at Podcast Stardust.
All right. The just aligned, the signal's boosted to maximum output, the shield is down. We are now broadcasting to the galaxy. So, like I said, we're talking about the first episode of Season 2 of Light and Magic, which is the documentary series about industrial light and magic. Shouldn't be any big surprise. And I remember, a couple years ago, we got Season 1 that was kind of a surprise, interesting hit with everything it told us about what was going on behind the scenes with the visual effects company. And then they surprised us with a second season of it. And so we're trying to work our coverage in this around everything else that we're covering this month, which is a lot. But Jay, this wasn't something that was really on my radar, but I enjoyed Season 1. I was looking forward to Season 2. And I got to tell you, this first episode was absolutely incredible. What was your reaction to it?
Yeah, you just took the words right out of my mouth because I went into this with, I don't want to say really, high expectations, but like you, the first season was great, but this really did. It was so impressive, and just the scope and sequence and everything about what we saw in this episode just is so substantial in everything that we know and love about just our experience with movies in general. And I was so impressed and just blown away.
Yeah. And it presented a challenge for me when I'm trying to figure out how to talk about this, because I don't want to do like a moment by moment recap of the documentary, because everyone should go out and watch it for themselves. And then I watched it the first time and I was trying to figure out how to put my notes together. So I pulled it back up so I could, with the thought that I was just going to skip around and, get names and a few key quotes and stuff like that. And I ended up watching the whole thing a second time. And this is only the first of the 3 episodes. And I just got so sucked into it on this. And it kind of reminded me of my, my experience watching it reminded me more of watching the documentary about John Williams than it did the first season of Light and Magic. And I think that's because this one was more Star Wars focused than most of the first season of Light and Magic, which was talking about visual effects for all kinds of projects, not just Star Wars.
Yes. Yeah. I agree.
So let's get into it here. One of the things that, jumped out to me at the beginning is how eager everyone was at ILM to work on a Star Wars movie. They hadn't had one since 1983 at this point. And this is really coming off the success that they had with Jurassic Park. And we got to see that in the prior season about how they created the dinosaurs and surprised Steven Spielberg with how well they worked in CG. And now we're slowly working towards the potential for a Star Wars. And basically everybody there at ILM is like, hey, George, you gonna do another Star Wars? George, another Star Wars? Hey, George, how about another Star Wars? And then they finally get this meeting. John Knoll was talking about the staff meetings that George would have. And then Gene Bolt, who's a digital artist, distinctly remembers that there was this meeting coming up, and it was strongly hinted that there was going to be an announcement that you didn't want to miss. And it's when he told everybody that they're going to make another Star Wars and how excited they all got. But I just absolutely love that.
Oh, yeah. And what really hit me about this whole thing is, of course, we know how incredible George Lucas is in his innovation and his forward thinking and just everything that he brought to the table creatively, not just with bringing us the story of Star Wars, but how he brought it to us.
Mhm.
And this just really punctuates that in so many ways, that he just was not wanting to write this until he felt that it was the right time. He had so many ideas in his head about the way that, things should progress digitally instead of doing things, he felt like, okay, we've done as much as we can with analog. Now we've got to do more digital. But he was waiting until just that right moment. And then as soon as they had the script, it was, from then on, it was, we're going to do the impossible.
Mhm.
This is gonna get made. We're gonna, and everybody kept saying, this movie's not gonna happen. This movie's not gonna happen. And George was like, nope, it's gonna happen. So I was just impressed overall with George Lucas in that regard, that he is such a genius in so many ways, but he's also very um unrealistically realistic,
Yeah.
if that makes any sense. And I was floored. Just
Yeah.
completely floored.
What you're talking about, the impossibility of it, that's my favorite quote from this whole thing, and I went back and I made sure I wrote it down. George Lucas, he's talking to the crew about, yeah, he knows this is difficult and he's encouraging them. And it was amazing how encouraging it was to his staff.
Mhm.
But the quote is, I know it's going to work because it is impossible, but we're the only ones in the world that can pull this off. I just love that. He's like, his faith in his team when they're doubting themselves. There, we saw Rob Coleman was talking about all the anxiety he had, and he's the
Yeah.
animation supervisor, because he's going home every night and he's thinking about how many millions of people have been waiting for this movie, the Phantom Menace, and he does not want to disappoint them. He does not want to let them down. And so he goes and has a conversation with George Lucas, and George is like, what are you talking about? You only have to make one person happy. That's me, and I'm happy with the work. And then apparently Rob went
Mhm.
home and passed out. And
Yes.
his insomnia just went away. He hadn't been able to sleep, and I've been keeping him up, but that's all he needed to hear. And he got that confidence boost from George.
Right, right. And there's just, as far as George goes, in this almost ragtag bunch of people, like they talked about everyone that worked on these things as being, like the bad boys and the rebels and the outcasts. And that's exactly the kind of crew that he needed to be able to pull something like this off. He needed a bunch of people that were willing to think outside the box and color outside the lines and just really, throw caution to the wind essentially, and just try things until they worked.
Mhm, mhm. Another thing, I did not realize how crucial to the success of all of this was that the Casper movie played in all of
Right.
this. I mean, I
Insane.
forgot that movie even existed here,
Mhm.
but it was the first movie where they were doing a computer generated main character that was going to be throughout the entire movie. And then that like taught them how they had to think about this. It's like,
Mhm.
how are you going to account for this character being in the shot when you were filming and then integrating it later? And I can't recount everything, how important that was, but I was like, who would have thought? I mean, I would just thought like, yeah, you guys did Jurassic Park onto the Phantom Menace, but no, it took something like, was that in Dragonheart, which I was really excited to see in this as
Yes.
well. But I just could not get over, it's like Casper. Wow, who would have thought that movie was that important to special effects?
Right. And how about Ahmed Best being the very first motion capture ever,
Yeah,
for a character?
yeah, yeah. Well, and I want to back up to Dragonheart just because Jar Jar is such a huge part of this whole thing, and he
Yes.
deserves a big conversation here. But just seeing what they went through to animate Dragonheart, going back from that line that they took out of Doctor No, James Bond Doctor No, is where Sean Connery says there's no such thing as dragons, and
Yes.
then you had Rob Coleman talking about they discovered the way they could sell these characters, these computer generated characters, is when they matched the animation to the voice actor's performance.
Mhm.
And one of the things they did was they mimicked the way that Sean Connery would talk, is where he'd start on one side of his mouth, and then his speech would essentially go across his face. He'd start like talking on the right side, and then his last words would come out of his left side of his mouth. And they actually showed an example of that. And I was like, huh, I never really noticed that.
That
But
was
then,
genius.
yeah, but then
Mhm.
they captured it for Draco, the dragon, and they showed it to the director of that film. He's like, "This is genius. This is exactly what I needed." And I was like, "Okay, two sources I would not have expected to be as important as they were, Casper and Draco." But there we
Right.
go on that.
Right. Yep. And what's I think so incredible about that as well is, like I was saying, inspiration comes from the most unexpected of places. And they had to do these kinds of things almost in a test field, and Casper and Dragonheart were sort of the test field for, all of these other things going forward. But, again, ILM just being a company in and of itself, out of the ideas and the collective brain pan of all of these people that worked for George is just it's just so impressive.
Yeah. And again, before we get to Jar Jar, there's just a couple of characters I want to talk about. Characters, people. Rick McCallum on this.
Oh
He
gosh.
he wasn't actually in the whole thing more than a few minutes,
Mhm.
but every time he showed up, it's like he is a character, like out of your favorite
Mhm.
mob movie or something like that. He just, and the way George Lucas would talk about him, like, the quote George Lucas has, like, movies are run well, like most things that are run well, on a combination of fear and loyalty.
Yeah.
And that's what Rick McCallum was brought in for. I mean, he put the fear of God in all these people so that they could maintain the budget, because George Lucas self-funds his movies
Mhm.
on this. And so they had to be more mindful of the budget than ever. And the example of that is, I can't remember which one of the effects guys it was talking about how, they gave him an estimate that, we could do this for $102 million. And then McCallum gave him back a card that said 62 million all in. And he gave him a place to sign. Like, you understand that's your budget for this.
Yes.
And,
And there
you
was
know,
no wiggle room.
no. And then, the one producer also says, it's like, after meeting with McCallum, he was like, he could be extremely generous to you, but then there's other instances you get out of a meeting, it's like you feel like you're going to bleed out on the way to your car. And so
Yeah.
I just got a kick out of the way everyone was talking about him. But he got the
Yes.
job done. I mean, he got the
He
movie
sure
produced.
did. But,
So,
I mean, you have to have somebody like Rick McCallum to do those kinds of things and go to
mhm.
bat for you, because that's the only way that, you can get some of that kind of stuff done. So, yeah, that was cracking me up. And it just lent itself even more to that whole bad boy outcast, kind of ragtag group that George Lucas was talking about, they were talking about in the beginning, that they just kind of all came together. Speaking of, how about Doug Chiang? I
Yeah,
mean, we got to see the genesis of his whole career, and the fact that, hello, he didn't even go to art school.
right.
He was self-taught, and then he's sitting there and he's talking about how, he's doing these drawings and they're not very good. And of course I'm looking at him going, "What the heck are you talking about, Doug?"
Yeah.
These are
Well,
incredible.
it's like, how many people that were there at ILM have imposter syndrome? I mean,
Yeah,
you heard Rob Coleman talking about that. He
right?
was like the ninth
Mhm.
computer generated animator there on the thing, and he's like, I don't belong here. And then Doug Chang's talking about his art's not very good, and he's got this inferiority complex because he didn't go to art school, and he's talking about how much he
Mhm.
struggles with art. I was like, I would kill to be able to draw half as good as you
Right.
do, Doug. It's
Exactly.
But he's
Exactly.
just humble in that way.
He is, and he still is, which I think
Hmm.
is so incredible, and that's what I think helps not only with his, creativity, but his artistic integrity as well,
Hmm.
and just staying humble in that way. But I mean, just seeing some of those videos of him so young, and you could tell, especially when he was with George and he was trying to, drink in everything that George was trying to tell him. And, at one point he was even talking about he didn't have a notebook. And so he was
Yeah.
writing all this stuff down on napkins, trying
Hmm.
to like remember everything that George Lucas wanted. Cause he's like, I'm in a room with George Lucas. You don't say, wait a second, or I have to stop and do. He's like, you just do it. You just,
Yeah.
and he said it a
And
little differently than that, but it was, you get the idea.
yeah, and that scene that they're showing during the documentary, it made me laugh because this happened like 3 or 4 times throughout the documentary. George is like meeting with people, and he's just unloading all of this
Yes.
information on people. Like, he's giving them details, giving details. He's like, okay, goodbye, and then he just walks out the door.
Hmm.
It's just like,
Well, yeah.
and when he's meeting with Doug Chiang. He's describing all these things he wants that he needs
Uh-huh.
Doug to design. And then he's like, okay, goodbye. And he walks out the door. And then you just get the camera on Doug Chiang's face for a second. And it's just like everything is sinking in about what he has to do. It's just,
Yes.
and it was brilliant that they didn't actually like say anything in that moment. They just let the picture do the talking with that. You could just see Doug is like, he's got 1,000 things going through his head that he has to figure out how to
Mhm.
create for George Lucas.
Exactly, and you don't wanna let George Lucas down, that's for sure. But
Yeah.
then they would bring in all those storyboards, and you'd see
Mhm.
hundreds and hundreds of storyboards, and then there's George with his highlighters, and just so quickly just, like, highlighting in yellow or green or pink or whatever, and
Yeah.
just zoo, 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 and you
That's
have
real. That's not real. That's real. That's not real.
yes, and just crossing things out and highlighting other things. But, I'm wondering what happened to all of those storyboards. Like, would you not love to get your hands on just one little portion of one of those storyboards? I know that would be incredible for me.
Oh, I'm hoping they're still at Skywalker Ranch
They gotta
somewhere.
be, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Somewhere.
Yeah. Well, hey, if we ever go on the Disney Wish and we buy that $5,000 cocktail and we get our passes to go to it, all right, we can confirm one way or the
There you
other.
go.
So,
There you go.
all right, let's talk about Jar Jar. We put this off long enough here. I was just amazed at how much of a team effort it was putting Jar Jar together on this. I mean, it
Mhm.
seemed like everybody touched this character.
It is. Yep.
But I mean, he came out of George Lucas's mind with a vague description, and then it was up to Doug Chiang and then Terrell Whitlatch were the ones that were there in the art department at the time. And the breakthrough moment they had was Terrell's little frog creature that she
Mhm.
drew,
Just for
and
fun. Yep.
yeah, and then George Lucas is like, "That's the closest to what I have in mind." And like you said, it was just something that she had sketched for fun, and then from there, they iterated all these different things, like, now make it look more like an alligator, now make it more look like a pig, now, no, get rid of the pig, make it more look like a salamander, and then, they added the ears and stuff until they finally ended up with what was Jar Jar, and it was really cool seeing all that different concept art as they cycled through it to
Yeah.
get there. That's one of my favorite things about the art of the books, especially for the original trilogy, like all the different iterations of Yoda and stuff like
Mhm.
that, but all these different
Mhm.
iterations of Jar Jar, just seeing the thought process that that they went through to get to the final product.
Right, and just what felt right and what felt organic enough to be able to use that as that particular character. And, another thing I really thought was super cool was just that George had this in his head that he wanted this to be this Buster Keaton type
Yes.
comedic character. And, even after they brought Ahmed in and he sat down with George and they watched these videos of, these old movies of Buster Keaton over and over and over again so that Ahmed could get that physicality down, which he had a lot of the original, kind of physical ability that they were looking for just naturally because when Robin Gurland saw Ahmed Best in that Stomp on
Mhm.
Broadway or wherever it was, and she said, "This is our Jar Jar. This is exactly how we want him to move. This is what we're looking for." I just thought that was such a cool origin story that way too.
Oh, yeah, and if you were paying attention, they showed some of those Buster Keaton reels, and
Yes.
it's like those
Mhm.
were adapted into the Phantom Menace. There was
Yes,
the one, like,
totally.
where, the Buster Keaton's, like, wandering around, he's got that mini cannon, like, strapped on that end of that rope, and it's like every time he, like, tries to run away from it, it falls around and it, like, aims at him again. Well, that's the
Mhm.
battle droid
Yep.
the Jar Jar's foot gets stuck in. And then there's the scene where Buster Keaton's, like, running down the hill with some rocks bouncing after him. Well, that's Jar Jar running away from
The
the
Boombas. Yeah.
yeah. And so, that was I was like, "Wow, I had no idea that they just that type of homage was made in this
Right.
movie." I thought that was just someone being witty, but they got that from Buster Keaton.
Exactly, and there's so many different inspirations, that we learn about in this as well, like, as we talk about the pod race too.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, before we get to Padres, I just want to talk a bit more about Jar Jar there. Again, it was really cool watching them work out how they were going to bring Jar Jar to life. And I didn't know that the original plan was it was going to be a suit from the neck down, and then
Mhm,
it was going to be CG from the neck up.
mhm.
But then there was some reservations about that. And the reason they're going to do that is for expense. It was thought that would be
Right.
cheaper. If we're only having to animate this character from the neck up, it's less expensive than having to animate the entire character. But John Knoll and Rob Coleman didn't really like that because, as Coleman was pointing out, I was like, if you're off by a pixel, you would notice it and it
Mhm.
would disrupt your belief in the character. And John Knoll, let's face it, he wanted to animate the entire character. He was not going to be satisfied
Right.
doing the whole thing. So they set out to prove it would be cheaper to animate the entire character and that it would look better than if they just did from the neck up. But they kind of fudged the test a little bit where they gave the neck up version to a slower animator and then the full animation version to a faster animator. And then they projected it was going to be, I can't remember, like $1 million cheaper to do the full character than it would be just from the neck up. And I just got to get a chuckle out of that story that, John Knoll, who George Lucas describes as a genius over the course of this thing, figured out a way that he could use the toys that he wanted the way he wanted them to get the character he wanted out of all
Mhm.
this.
It's true. Yep, it's true. And Ahmed Best was such an incredible soul through this whole thing too. You could
Mm-hmm.
just tell how on board he was. Obviously anybody who's going to be cast as something is going to put their heart and soul into it, but I mean, he really really just in completely embodied Jar Jar in a
Oh
way
yeah.
that like no one else could ever have done and ever would be able to do again.
Well, the other thing that stood out to me about this is just that again, with Ahmed Best's performance, he just went with the flow on whatever was asked for
Mhm.
him. He got the role, which completely surprised him. He showed up at Skywalker Ranch and he saw all the people there that from the fire department that had the logos on it, and he's like, I don't know
Oh,
what's going on here,
yeah.
but I want to make sure I get to the second level of this. And then so okay, he's doing the performance, and he gets cast in this by George Lucas. Robin Gurland's suggestion. He spends 2 years working with George about what it is that George wants. And so he's on set doing the performance. And then he goes through the whole bit where, it's going to be animated from the neck up. And then when they decide that's not what they want to do, they're going to animate the entire character. George says he does not want to lose the essence of Ahmed in this because he really liked what Ahmed Best was bringing to the role.
Mhm.
So that's when they went to the motion capture thing. And
Yes.
that's like how they developed that for this technology here. They did the motion capture so they could get the essence of Ahmed and then draw the character right there. And that was just so incredibly cool. But again, it's just like I did not realize how integrated everybody was. I mean, it was George working directly with Ahmed Best that closely. It was Ahmed Best working with Rob Coleman. He says, Rob Coleman is like the greatest. He talks about how incredible Rob is. And there's a shot of Coleman talking about how he can fully animate this character. And Ahmed Best is like, oh, that's really cool. And so I kind of feel like actors act, animators animate. I didn't really expect their paths to cross as much as they did, but
Mhm.
it really was this major collaborative effort to bring that character to life.
It really was, and just the whole journey of that to watch how
Hmm.
that took place was incredible.
Hmm. So we're about to get to the pod race, but there's a slight diversion, and that is, they're getting ready to do all this filming, but they always make an animatic of the movie before they film it, so they know the shots that they need to get. So they turned to Ben Burt, the editor, to do this, and we didn't get to see the whole thing, obviously, but it was really cool seeing like all these little clips of other movies that he put together. And then he
Yeah.
got footage of his son. They built these little like knockoff pod racers, and he filmed his son in front of a green screen and a Sebulba puppet and another pod racer, so he could insert those in there. But it's the pod race, and you see all these like various shots of race car drivers and then crowd reactions from
Mhm.
things.
Mhm.
That was I would love to see that cut. I think that we did Hardware Wars and we've done Troops and stuff like that. I think the Ben Burton take on the Phantom
Yes.
Menace would be really really fun to watch.
Oh, yeah, 100%, and how cool is that, like, his son to be
Mhm.
able to look back on this and be like, "Yeah, I was the very first pod racer ever,"
The
you
first Anakin.
know?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So that would have been really cool to see.
indeed.
But the pod race, I didn't realize Ben Hur, the chariot race from that movie, was like big inspiration for George
I
for all
did
of that.
not either. Yeah, that was a very cool thing to reveal.
But once they said it, it made complete sense.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But the thing they focused on there was the physics of the pod racers. And this was really cool watching John Knoll and Habib. I'm going to try and pronounce his last name, Zargarpur. These were the
Mhm.
two that worked out the physics there. And they just were like big physics geeks. And they wanted the pod racers to move and do it realistically. So they designed this invisible framework that would surround the pod race models, and they kind of like did springs and stuff like that, that so that the one engine would influence the other, and then if one would bounce, the other one would react and stuff like that. And then they went so far as to figure out how the pod racers would blow up.
Yes.
I love the quote. George Lucas just does like things like disappearing, just like disappearing into the explosion. He wants to see them fall apart, and how they had to create, like the impacts. And so like a thing would dissolve into 3,000 parts.
Yes. I was so impressed with that, and the whole Formula 1 crashes that they
Mhm.
used as inspiration, I was completely mesmerized by this whole process, and you're right, I mean, physics geeks is the best way to put it, in the nicest way, because they were so into this from every step of the way, and like you said, just the way that things would fall apart, and then, like, they were talking about then adding the smoke, and then adding the dust, and then, that kinetic energy that goes with it, and
Mm.
just watching all those Formula 1 crashes, and you think to yourself, "Oh my gosh, like, there's people in those cars," but, I mean, realistically, you look at those crashes, and then you look at the pod race, and it's perfect.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes complete sense. I didn't
Yeah.
realize that that was the inspiration for that as well, but they captured it. They nailed it when they
Mhm.
did so
Yep,
on there.
for
Um,
sure.
I had never heard of Habib prior to this. And I'm
I didn't
wondering
either.
why. Because the guy seemed brilliant. He seemed like a fun interview. Why don't we hear more about Habib and his
Mhm.
influence on this entire process? So I don't know. Maybe we'll get him more in seasons 2 and 3.
Yeah,
We'll
let's
find
hope
out.
so.
And then the whole thing, the ends with a couple shots in there. They're talking about the models of the Bunta Eve racetrack, and you got Doug Chiang talking about how everyone thinks all this stuff is CG, and that's not true. There are actually more models in the Phantom Menace than there were in the 3 previous movies combined.
That blew me away. I did not
Yeah,
expect that.
I mean, I knew there were plenty of models, but I didn't realize. Yeah, I did not realize there was that many models of them, because that
Mhm.
seemed like the whole point of the CG was to get away from the models.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
it kind of reminded me of the Mandalorian panel at Star Wars Celebration Chicago, where they were talking about the Razor Crest, and it was this entirely digitally created thing until John Knoll like went home and built one in his garage. And one of the
Right.
things that John Favreau was teasing Dave Filoni about this is like, yeah, you can't put a bit file on your desk. And so that was the benefit of having a model of the Razor Crest here. So I guess the same logic applies. But I did like the fact that they were building models, and that model was so cool.
Oh,
Uh,
for sure.
mhm.
And it's another thing too, like, wouldn't you like to have just a little piece of that?
Yeah, and I like the story John Knoll told about it. That's like, George Lucas doesn't usually deliver a whole lot of direct praise. And so, they showed it. They showed George Lucas coming out to see the model. And
Mhm.
so he was asking for a few things on it, then he left. And then all of a sudden, like one of the editors calls up John Knowles, like, "Hey, is that model still out? I want to come see it because George won't quit raving about it." And
You're like,
so,
"He was?"
yeah. And so you could just kind of see how pleased John was with all that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that really tickled me too.
Yeah. And then we get our cliffhanger ending about the reaction to the New York Times review of the whole movie. So that will
Mhm.
set us up for episode 2 when we get to that in a few weeks. But
Yeah,
do
looking
you have any
forward
other
to it.
final thoughts on this? I mean, I just absolutely loved it. It was
Oh, yeah.
such a good watch.
Yeah, I agree. And, again, going into it, I was like, "Oh, yeah, this is exciting. Okay, whatever." But totally recommend this to anybody that wants to know more behind the scenes kinds of things. And I'm so into all that behind the scenes stuff anyways, and I'm just so fascinated by the whole design process. So it was very gratifying to watch this.
Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff I've heard from other places, but the way they wrapped it up and presented it here, especially with the extra input that we got from George Lucas in this episode,
Mhm.
which I think, to my memory, it's way more than we got from him in season 1.
I agree.
And just hearing him and just, him talking about, he's so proud of ILM, and it comes through here about what they were able to accomplish and how they changed the way that movies are made on this. It
Hmm.
can't be understated on that. And just getting to see his excitement to talk about that. And now you realize what it is that he really loved about the movies. It was the innovation
Right.
that they came up with to tell these stories. And when you hear comments now about how he was kind of like disappointed in The Force Awakens, well, it's because they didn't develop anything new. It's not necessarily
Hmm.
the story itself. He was looking for innovation, and that's what
Exactly.
he got when he did the prequels. So,
Exactly. Well said.
all right. Well, then that'll do it for our discussion of episode 1 of season 2 of Light and Magic. Thank you all for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed it. We'll be back in a few weeks with our discussion of episode 2 of season 2. We really had to work hard to make our schedule this month,
Yes.
but we got Andor and Tales of the Underworld coming up. So be patient, and we're going to get to the rest of this when we get a chance on our schedule. But it'll be before the month is over, maybe at the very end of the month, but it'll be before the month is over. But with that having been said, make sure you subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so already, and you'll get that whenever it shows up, as well as our coverage of Andor Season 2, Tales of the Underworld, news, and our other features that we do on a monthly basis. And if you want to find more episodes of Podcast Stars, including our coverage of season 1 of Light and Magic, the best place to do that is over at retrozap.com, which has the entire catalog of shows. Jay, you want to remind everybody where we can be found online and social media?
Oh, I would love to. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Podcast Stardust. And we do maintain our Pinterest boards with tons of ideas for everything Star Wars. And then we do have 2 YouTube outlets. So we have the traditional YouTube as well as YouTube Music. So head over to both of those, like, subscribe, and share those out as well. We would really appreciate that. And another thing we would appreciate is if you would support us on our T Public store. So if you need a closet refresh or some spring or summer wardrobe items, you can head over to TeePublic. The link to that will be in our show notes. And we do have 7 different show logo designs available on all kinds of fun things. And if you do happen to pick something up, every purchase does help to support the show. So we would love that if you would do that. And also take some pictures and tag us and show us where it ends up out in the wild. And we recently had Daz Davies from Japan at Celebration Star Wars that had posted a picture of himself at Celebration wearing a Podcast Artist t-shirt. So we really appreciate you, Daz. Thank you.
Indeed, indeed. Jay, you want to remind everybody what you got going on in cosplay before we go?
Sure. So you can always check out what I'm up to on my Instagram, which is at j.snipscosplay. And I have a couple of appearances coming up here and also just finished. So you can check out pictures and all the interactions from that. And I'm also posting tons of things on my feed and in my stories on all of my cosplays, including Ahsoka, the fourth sister, my 2 different versions of Hera, my original concept Mandalorian, Leia, and so much more.
Okay, upcoming on the show this Friday, we are getting back into Andor with a look at episodes 7 through 9 of season 2, and then on Monday we are rounding up some recent Star Wars news and covering it there. So, with all that said, thanks for listening to episode 883 of Podcast Stardust, everyone. Have a great rest of your week, and until next time, may the Force be with you.